Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Quran, What Everyone Needs to Know, by Jane Mcauliffe, narrated by Rosemary Benson. Preface. Not long ago, I took yet another flight to Cairo, a city that has fascinated me since my first visit more than 30 years ago. The trip was prompted by an invitation from Dr. Ahmed Al-Tayeb, the Sheikh Al-Azhar, to speak at Al-Azhar University. Founded in 970, more than a century before any European university, Cairo's Al-Azhar University has attracted students from all over the Muslim world for more than a millennium and has produced more religious scholars than any other such institution. Many have dubbed Al-Azhar the Islamic Vatican, and its leader, the Sheikh Al-Azhar, the Muslim Pope. While the comparison falls short on several counts, Islam has no ordained clergy or centralized hierarchy. It captures the prestige of both the university and its leader within the world of Sunni Islam. Dr. Al-Tayeb had invited a group of people, most of whom were former heads of state from Europe, Central Asia, and the Middle East, to speak on the topic Islam and the West, Diversity and Integration. He also invited a few scholars, some from nearby universities and some from far away, to join the conversation and to provide insights from the university worlds that they represent. I was the only American among that handful of scholars, so I spoke about Islam in the United States and Canada, about how it is studied in our academic institutions, and about how American interest in Islam has skyrocketed in recent decades. The return flight from Cairo to my home in Washington, D.C., provided time for reflection on all that has changed since my first trip there, and on all that has remained the same. Certainly the streetscape has shifted significantly, with much more traffic and pollution and many more women in head coverings and even face veils. Demographers will tell you that Cairo ranks among the world's fastest-growing cities, and that its burgeoning population puts it on track to become one of the most congested urban areas on the planet. Yet much endures. The culture of coffee shops and intellectual salons, the labyrinthine bazaars and open-air markets, the myriad bookstores, large and small, offering just about everything published in the Arabic-speaking world, and the whole institutional infrastructure of a major Muslim city. Cairo's mosques and minarets span the centuries of Islamic architectural achievement. Its libraries and museums house an immense heritage, manuscripts dating back to the earliest periods of Islamic history. Its institutes and universities draw students from across the globe and educate religious leaders who serve not just in Egypt, but in many other countries as well. And over it all floats the 5-time daily call to prayer, its evocative sounds reverberating from one loudspeaker to another across this vast metropolitan area. I also thought about how well the conference topic, Islam and the West, suited the city that had hosted it. For centuries, Cairo has been a crossroads, as merchants, travelers, soldiers, and seekers thronged its streets, and then stayed to shape its history. Facing to the east and to the west, with a history that subsumes both military occupation and peaceful settlement, the city now presents itself as a premier cosmopolitan center of the Muslim world. But it's a cosmopolitan center that suffers. The dashed hopes of the Arab Spring, subsequent authoritarian restrictions, terrorist attacks against both Muslims and Christians, all have combined to severely damage the city's and the country's economic and social stability. It is against this recent background that Muslim religious leaders came together in Cairo to convene on an ongoing dialogue between the world of Islam and the world of the West. What they did, and what they will continue to do, mirrors efforts in North America, Europe, and elsewhere. The connectivity fostered by globalization, coupled with the increased tension generated by the tragedies of September 11th and other terrorist atrocities, has created an intellectual hunger on both sides of the divide between the West and the Islamic world. Americans, Europeans, and others in the West want adequate and reliable information about Islam and the Muslim world. But what they get is often misleading, distorted, and sensationalized. To offset this, those of us who know something about these subjects have been working overtime to correct the inaccuracies and to stop the flow of misinformation. Many religious leaders and scholars in the Muslim world are on a similar quest. They want to know how people in non-Muslim countries learn about Islam, the Quran, and the fundamentals of Muslim faith and practice, because they too are fully aware of the falsehoods and fabrications that often pass for the truth in many American and European media outlets, whether news media or social media. Even more urgently, they seek to present a counter-narrative to the perverse and corrupted versions of Islam preached by groups like the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Boko Haram. I hope this book will be helpful in their efforts. All of my professional life, both Muslims and non-Muslims have quizzed me about why I chose to focus my doctoral studies and subsequent research and teaching on Islam and the Quran. For many Muslims, this can present a doctrinal difficulty. It's a point of faith that if someone comes to really know and understand the religion of Islam, its obvious truth will prompt conversion. Trying to explain my fascination with Islamic thought and culture, or to express a more generalized interest in human religious experience, usually doesn't work very well as a response. Yet my initial interest in the study of Islam grew out of just such motivations. As a young graduate student, one who had spent all her earlier years in Catholic schools, I was very curious about other religious traditions and about the philosophical questions generated by the encounter of those traditions, such as Islam and Christianity, that make universalistic claims, that see themselves as the final truth, the fulfillment of the divine human encounter. As my studies progressed and I became more immersed in the primary sources, chiefly Arabic and Persian, of Muslim religious thought, I found myself sweeping back and forth between the extremes of familiarity and bewilderment. Much of what I was learning echoed teachings and topics familiar from my own religious tradition, but much else did not. Over and over I was both struck by Islam's similarities with Christianity and Judaism and intrigued by the differences. Through all those years of graduate school, and then initial academic appointments, my study of Islam and the Quran could be considered an interesting historical and textual exploration, one that allowed me to introduce students and audiences to an important part of human culture. In those earlier years, it never occurred to me that understanding Islam and the Muslim world would become a matter of national and international consequence, or that it would be a source of such sadness. In recent years, news of heinous actions committed in the name of Islam has appeared in depressing regularity. Despite the efforts of Muslim religious leaders to denounce these events, the association of Islam and terrorism has seeped deeply into popular consciousness. Finally, a more personal memory that will remain with me from that conference in Cairo was the experience of being a woman in that setting and on that stage. Not surprisingly, women were a tiny minority. 33 men spoke at the Al-Azhar gathering, but only 3 women, 2 of them from nearby institutions. Yet I was warmly welcomed and graciously treated. Many faculty members and students in the audience expressed a strong interest in my presence there as a female educator and scholar. While most of these with whom I chatted were male, I can recall a particularly lively exchange with a cluster of young women from Malaysia who surrounded me after one of the formal sessions. Their questions ranged from the professional to the personal. They were as curious about my husband and children as about the books I had published. They are studying at Al-Azhar so that they can become religious leaders and teachers in their own country, and they form part of a fast-expanding vanguard of educated and inspiring young Muslims, whose progress I will follow with eager enthusiasm. A few concluding comments. 1. I have cited passages from the Quran by chapter, surah in Arabic, number, and by verse number. For example, Q 24:35 refers to the 24th chapter of the Quran, traditionally entitled The Light, and to the 35th verse within that chapter. Using these citations, listeners can locate passages in the many different English translations that are currently available. While there can be slight variation in the verse numbering of some translations, context should be sufficient to avoid ambiguity. 2. Quotations from the Quran are from my The Quran, a Norton Critical Edition, New York 2017. 3. Whenever possible, I have avoided using Arabic terminology if a commonly found English translation exists, or if the Arabic word finds frequent mention in popular publications. Examples of the latter would be terms like jihad or hijab. 4. Most importantly, I beg listeners to bear in mind that demographers now reckon the world Muslim population to be 1.6 billion, and members of that population may be found in every country and culture on earth. Consequently, there is no single Islam. There is no single way of thinking and acting as a Muslim. And there is no single and unequivocal interpretation for any verse in the Quran. Recognizing that diversity, this book can offer succinct and straightforward responses to questions frequently asked about the Quran. But it cannot be, nor does it seek to be, the last word on the subject. Part 1. The Book and Why It Matters. When you pull a copy of the Quran off a library shelf, or pick one up in a bookshop, you'll find yourself holding a volume of average size and shape. You may spot an adjective in the title, the Holy Quran, or the Glorious Quran, and flipping through the pages, you may or may not see Arabic writing on one side and English on the other. You'll probably notice that there are different sections, and that within the sections the text is further divided and numbered. If you turn to the first page and begin to read, some of the words will have a familiar ring. Words like God and Lord and merciful, and you'll soon realize that you're reading a prayer. Here it is in full. 1. In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful. 2. Praise be to God, Lord of the worlds. 3. The Beneficent, the Merciful. 4. Owner of the Day of Judgment. 5. You alone do we worship. You alone do we ask for help. 6. Show us the straight path. 7. The path of those whom you have favored, not the path of those who earn your anger, nor of those who go astray. But if you turn many more pages, that sense of familiarity will likely recede, and questions will begin to crowd your mind. Where did this book come from? Who wrote it? What does its name mean? Who created this format for it, and when was it put together? Why is it so important to millions, actually more than 1.5 billion people in this world? Our exploration of the Quran starts, then, with the historical context, so that this scripture can be situated in its time and place. It begins with the Prophet Muhammad and the religious environment into which he was born, and then explains how the Quran emerged during his lifetime, and what happened in the decades after his death. From these basics, the investigation can move to the shape and structure of the written text, and to discussion of some of its literary characteristics and special passages. An understanding of how it is put together helps in addressing a frequently asked question: why is the Quran so hard to read? People who have tried to tackle this text and found it difficult to do so can be forgiven for wondering how the Quran could matter so much to its believers. Delving into some key beliefs and practices will explain why the Quran is supremely important to Muslims, and why its influence on both individuals and entire societies has been and remains so powerful. Knowing what Muslims, both Sunni and Shi'i, believe about the Quran, and learning something about the care with which they treat the written text, will help listeners understand the place that it holds in Muslim minds and hearts. 1. Origins. Where did the Quran come from? Compared with other world scriptures, the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, the Buddhist sutras, or the Tao Te Ching, the Quran's history is reasonably clear and straightforward, at least as conveyed in traditional Muslim accounts. These accounts start, of course, with the Prophet Muhammad, who is described as a morally upright man and a spiritual seeker. Over a period of about 2 decades, these sources say, Muhammad received visions and heard voices that Muslims understand to be direct messages from God, via an angel identified as Gabriel. Muhammad proclaimed these divine revelations to his growing band of followers, and eventually all the revelations were gathered together and organized into what we can now hold in our hands as the Quran. This traditional account situates these encounters between Muhammad and the angel in the Arabian Peninsula, specifically the western side of the peninsula that runs parallel to the Red Sea, in the towns of Mecca and Medina. The time frame is the early 17th century, roughly the same period that Buddhism was entering Tibet and that Irish monks were setting up monasteries in Scotland and the north of England. But that is only part of the story. For Muslim believers, the Quran has an eternal prehistory. The real answer to where did the Quran come from is simply that it came from God. It is important to emphasize that we are not talking about the divine inspiration of a human author. We are talking about God's direct speech. Muslims believe that the Quran, as it exists today, replicates exactly the divine words that were conveyed to Muhammad almost 14 centuries ago. Expanding upon many Quranic verses that speak about God's sending down of the Quran, Muslim theologians have attempted to describe this descent, this process by which the Quran moved from God to its earthly recipient. Chapter 85, verses 21 and 22, speaks of a glorious Qur'an on a guarded tablet, and other verses refer to the mother of the book. Both references have been taken to imply a heavenly archetype that is the ultimate source of all divine revelation, given first to earlier prophets like Moses and Jesus, and transmitted finally to Muhammad. As an intermediary stage, the Quran was sent down in its entirety to the lowest realm of heaven on the night of power, Chapter 97, verse 1. And from there, Gabriel brought sequential revelations to the Prophet Muhammad over the course of more than 2 decades. Commemorations of the Night of Power and of the descent of the Quran occur toward the end of Ramadan, the Muslim month of fasting. Questions about the relation of the Quran, as God's speech, to God himself stimulated a major controversy in the first centuries of Islam. Was that speech a divine attribute? That is, was it eternal with God, or was it created by God? Eventually, a majority consensus produced the Sunni doctrine of the Quran as eternal and uncreated, but not before much ink and blood had been spilled in defending both possibilities. Who is Muhammad? Did he write the Quran? Few men in history can claim the enduring impact achieved by Muhammad ibn Abdallah. He was born toward the end of the 6th century CE to a poor family in Mecca, a market town on the western side of the Arabian Peninsula. Orphaned early, Muhammad found work with local trading caravans, and as a young man attracted the attention of a wealthy widow who hired him and then married him. This marriage to Khadija bint Khuwaylid raised both his financial and social status, and Muhammad did not marry again until after her death. In adulthood, he was known to withdraw to the outskirts of Mecca for periods of prayer and seclusion. During one such retreat, an angelic figure, later identified as Gabriel, appeared to Muhammad and proclaimed, "Recite, in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot. Recite, and your Lord is the most bounteous, who teaches by the pen, teaches man what he knew not." Chapter 96, verses 1 through 5. The apparition startled Muhammad, who feared for his sanity and sought reassurance from his wife. Khadija managed to convince him that the revelation was divine, not demonic, and, along with a few others, she recognized him as a prophet of God. Among those whom she consulted was her cousin, a Christian monk named Waraka. He, too, confirmed the authenticity of Muhammad's experience and declared him to be God's messenger. Over the next 2 decades, these visionary incidents repeated themselves. Muhammad received the transmissions, and as his confidence in these experiences grew, began to tell his fellow Meccans about them, repeating verbatim what he had been told. Many of those who heard the messages, in turn, memorized them and passed them on to others. The core message that Muhammad preached to them identified God, Allah in Arabic, as the creator of all, the creator who has generously given humans all that they need to flourish, and to whom humans owe exclusive worship and unending gratitude. Just as God has been just and generous to humans, they must be equally just and generous to each other. Muhammad's early preaching carried strong denunciations of the Meccan elite for their abuse of the poor and the unprotected. Of course, these elites resented such criticism and rejected Muhammad's efforts to foster social and religious reform, finally forcing him to flee the city to protect himself and his growing band of followers. The prophet immigrated to a city about 200 miles north of Mecca and quickly assumed both political and religious leadership of his new home, Medina. This emigration in 622 CE was a watershed event for the new community, and marks year 1 of the Muslim calendar. After repeated hostilities between his followers in Medina and the people of Mecca, Muhammad's community triumphed and made a victorious return to his birthplace and to its central shrine, the Kaaba. During this entire period, Muhammad continued to receive revelations, all of which were eventually collected and assembled into the Quran. After a final pilgrimage, Hajj in Arabic, to the Kaaba, Muhammad died in 632 and was buried in Medina. Muslims believe that while God sent many prophets before Muhammad, including Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, he is the last one, the seal of the prophets. Over the following centuries, many would succeed Muhammad as religious and political leaders of the Muslim community, but none of them would be ranked as prophets. Muslim belief also holds that Muhammad was illiterate, ummi in Arabic. Consequently, he could not have written the Quran. It comes directly from God. God revealed this scripture to Muhammad just as he had revealed earlier scriptures to Moses, Jesus, and others, and he revealed it in Arabic. While Muhammad and Jesus are often compared as the founding figures of what have become the world's two largest religions, the difference in beliefs about them is important. Christians deify Jesus. For them, he is God as a human who was born, lived, died, and, crucially, was resurrected from the dead. Muslims do not believe that Muhammad is God, or that he is a manifestation of the divine. Muhammad is a human being, albeit a holy, sinless, and venerated human being. Among Muslims, devotion to the Prophet Muhammad runs deep, and the imitation of his exemplary life and virtuous qualities shapes daily practice. Muslims revere him as the perfect model and as a source of divine grace and benefaction. The multiple roles that the Prophet embodied during his lifetime have directed the development of Islamic thought. Political philosophers see Muhammad as the perfect ruler, commander, and statesman. Mystics revere him for charting the course to spiritual enlightenment. Jurists draw upon his decisions and pronouncements to shape the structures of Islamic law. Especially after World War II, as post-colonial reform movements transformed the Muslim world, reformist ideologies looked to Muhammad's leadership in Medina as proof that the religious and the political are inextricably intertwined. The socio-political significance of his example validated Islam as a complete and comprehensive system of life, a robust alternative to Western models, and one that is fully compatible with modernity in all its aspects. Why does the Quran carry that name? First, let's deal with the different English spellings of this word. Koran, Koran, was an early attempt to mimic the pronunciation of the Arabic term, but that description has been largely replaced with the more accurate Quran, Qur''An, or Quran. Most major newspapers and other print media have now switched to this rendering, but it is still worth using both spellings when doing a library or an online search. The verb that underlines the classical Arabic word Qur'an signifies collecting and drawing together. By extension, the term carries the sense of reading or recitation, since it is the collecting and joining together of words that create meanings to be recited or read. Another combination of the same Arabic letters gives us the imperative verb iqra, usually translated as recite, the command to Muhammad when he begins receiving divine messages. The emphasis on recitation pervades the Quran, since revelation happens not as a silent, interior experience, but as a series of discrete oral discourses transmitted from God through an angelic intermediary to the Prophet Muhammad. The Quran associates itself with previous revelations, most explicitly in chapter 9, verse 111. God has bought from the believers their lives and their wealth, because the garden will be theirs. They shall fight in the way of God, and shall slay and be slain. It is a promise which is binding on him in the Torah and the Gospel and the Qur'an. In this verse, the term Qur'an comes closer to a sense of the full collection of divine disclosures.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?